We're returning to the accounts of the kings tonight for our next lesson in this series, and it'll be in 2 Kings chapter 6 is where we will be. We're going to learn a lesson from some lepers. This is another really fun story in a way, kind of gruesome in some ways, interesting, some neat twists and turns along the way. Not one that probably is very familiar to most people. Lepers factor into the story of the Bible surprisingly often, given the fact that if you had leprosy, you're supposed to be, kind of expelled from the camp and kept far away. They somehow keep kind of popping up in the story. We just saw Naaman the leper just recently in our series, I think chapter 5. And you recall at the end of that, in the next lesson, when we were looking at the story of the expensive clothes, how Elisha's servant went out and said, "I'll take those, Gehazi." And then the leprosy that had been on Naaman basically came on him as a punishment for that. And even in the New Testament, you might recall that Jesus cleansed 10 lepers. But you remember how many turned back to say, "Thank you," just one, right? So lepers kind of seem to factor in. They seem to be kind of just a common occurrence, this plague of leprosy. And we'll find some lepers in our story tonight and an interesting lesson that we can learn from them. What's going on in our chapter is that the capital of Israel, Samaria, is under siege. Kurt read for us just a few moments ago the blessings and curses from the law in Deuteronomy 28. Just a portion of those. It's actually a really long chapter. It goes on and on about how blessed you will be if you'll just obey. But it goes on for about twice or three times as long about how bad it's going to be for you if you disobey. And it says all these terrible things are going to come upon you. You're going to be defeated. You're going to have plagues. There'll be no rain. And all these horrible things will happen if you don't keep your end of the deal, the covenant that God was making with them. And we see that over and over. The people would turn away from God, and he would bring in some oppressor. He would bring in some plague. He would bring in some punishment with the hope that they would learn from their error and they would turn back to him. And so tonight we're in the middle of one of those times. The king, if I've got it right, is Jehoram. Like all the kings of Israel, he was a bad guy. They didn't have any good kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. And they just kind of went worse and worse and worse and worse as time goes on. So in our passage today, we find out that what's going on. We'll skip down to verse 24 of 2 Kings 6 for the beginning of this. Afterward, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Well, it's a little hard to figure out exactly what's going on here, but the overall picture is really clear. They're starving because they've been cut off. So they've eaten up everything that's good, and now they're down to just eating up stuff you wouldn't normally eat. So much so that somebody in a marketplace somewhere is selling donkey heads. Presumably these are donkeys that had themselves already starved to death, probably. And now now a donkey was not considered a clean food. They were not allowed to eat it. But it's desperate times. And so, that doesn't sound very appetizing, of course. But then even worse, some people were gathering up dove's dung and selling that. I mean, that's how bad it's gotten. I don't know exactly what they were doing with that, but it paints a very graphic and gross picture. You can imagine under a bridge or something where all the pigeons live. There's always on the ground, but imagine somebody being able to kind of scoop that together and then set it out and somebody come along and pay for it. That's how bad it was, and we just don't know how bad it would get if you and your family were starving to death and you're looking for anything with any kind of nutritional value at all. Whether they were going to use this for fuel or whether they were using it for food, I'm not sure. But that's how bad it is in the city. Now, if Kurt had read all of that chapter, one of the things it says in there, and again, very graphic terms, is things will be so bad for you that you will even turn to cannibalism. And that's actually what happens in this chapter. We won't read all the gory details, but there's a couple of families arguing because of that very subject of turning to cannibalism because of their starving. And we'll skip down to verse 30. If you'd like to read that for yourself, feel free. But the king is walking along the wall, and he overhears this arguing about cannibalism. And in verse 30, the king heard the words of the woman, and he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body. So the king is trying to keep up appearances. I mean, his people are starving. The people of the city are in terrible time. He's apparently wearing his kingly outfit, but they could see from their vantage point below that he's actually wearing, underneath that, he's wearing sackcloth. He's in mourning. He's grieving for his people, for his city, and they see that. And now when he overhears these families arguing about this question of cannibalism, he is distraught, and he says in verse 31, "May God do so to me and more also, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today." So he's decided Elisha's going to die. Now, what had Elisha done? It doesn't tell us anything. He had probably called out the sins of the people. He probably warned. He might have even foretold that this was going to happen. If you don't turn back, this is going to happen. He might have been preaching to the people, you need to repent. Whatever the case, usually God's people end up suffering in times like this. You might think of Jeremiah, who in a similar siege in Jerusalem, years later, would be thrown in a well and beaten, and horrible things happened to him just for being kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, although that's where God wanted him. That's where he needed to be. So, verse 32 says, Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king had dispatched a man from his presence, but before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" And while he was still speaking with him, the messenger came down to him and said, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" That makes me think that Elisha might have been saying to them, you're going to have to wait on the Lord. Because the king's message to him is, look, the Lord is doing this. Why should we trust in the Lord? Tell me why we should wait on the Lord. It's the Lord who's caused all this. Reminds me a little bit of the discussion we've seen in Job, right? Where they're arguing about, this is obviously God's doing. But in this case, it was a punishment. And so that's what they're saying to Elisha. Now, in chapter 7, verse 1, there's this remarkable, astounding prophecy. Elisha says, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Now, a seah is about 2 gallons. Best I can tell, it may enough to make 8 loaves of bread. And it's going to sell for a shekel, whereas the going rate for a donkey's head was 80 shekels. So just think about that. People in the city are dying, starving. There's nothing, so much so that they're selling doves, dung, and donkey heads. And Elisha says, I'll tell you what, tomorrow, around this time, you'll be able to go to the gate, and for a shekel, buy enough fine flour to make loaves of bread. That's amazing, isn't it? How could that happen? How could they suddenly go from starving to having so much readily available food? And in fact, that's the question the captain has. He doesn't believe it. Verse 2, the captain on whose hand the king leans said to the man of God, "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" But he said, as Elisha replied to him, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." So because this captain challenged the prophecy and questioned whether God could even make this happen, he's told, not only will you see this tomorrow with your own eyes, but you're not going to be able to enjoy any of it. So how is this all going to play out? That's what we're going to see as we go along. But now the scene kind of shifts to these lepers I mentioned to you. So there's 4 lepers. and they are parked there by the gate. We see this in verse 3. There were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate. And they said to one another, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, 'Let's enter the city,' well, there's famine in the city and we'll die there. If we sit here, we'll die. So come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we'll live. If they kill us, we shall but die." So they're sitting there by the gate, and finally this big aha moment. I don't know how long they've been sitting there. But now remember the plight of the lepers. The lepers couldn't be with everybody else. They were ostracized and kept away for health reasons, not just to be mean to them, but so that their leprosy wouldn't spread. The law required them to be kept separate. And so they relied on just the kindness of other people. So a lot of times they would sit and beg, and that's how they would get by. So they already had it rough before the famine came. And they're sitting there at the entrance of the gate, presumably, I'm assuming on the outside of the gate, maybe just on the inside. I don't know which side of the door they're on. But they're right there by the wall. And so in the city, things are getting terrible. Out there's the enemy. They're kind of in the middle. And they're thinking about this, and they say, you know what? If we go inside, we're going to die. If we stay here, we're going to die. The only choice we have that gives us a chance of living is to just go surrender. And who knows what they'll do to us, but maybe we won't die, or we'll die. But if we die, that's the worst that's going to happen, right? And if we stay here, we're going to die. If we go in there, we're going to die. So this is the only chance we got that gives us a chance of actually surviving. And so, verse 5 says, they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses, the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, "Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites, the kings of Egypt, to come against us." So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. So this is how God was going to keep his promise that he made through Elisha. He made the army panic and run off and leave all their stuff behind. So the lepers, who had just decided, let's go just surrender and see what happens, wander out there, and what they find is empty tents full of stuff, stocked with food, money, animals, livestock. So what do you think they did? Verse 8 says, then they came to the edge of the camp, they went in a tent, and they ate and they drank. They carried off the silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. They came back and entered another tent, carried off the things, and went and hid them. So they're thinking like, this is like their ships come in. All this stuff is sitting out there. It's been just left behind. It's like if you were walking along, you saw a $100 bill just lying on the ground, and there's nobody around, and you're in some big wide open place, and there's no way to find it. It's like, well, my lucky day, I guess, right? So they open it's like everything they go in there, they're just taking off this stuff, and they're running over and hiding it and coming back. They're eating, but their conscience starts to bother them. Why do you think they were feeling bad about this? Because they felt bad for the Syrians? No, that's not why. Look at verse 9. They said to one another, we're not doing right. This is a day of good news. If we're silent and wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they're thinking about this as they're running around, gathering all this stuff, eating all the food, hiding all the riches. Somebody finally had the forethought to think, sooner or later the sun's going to come up. So when the sun comes up, everybody in the city is going to realize what we know, and they're going to figure out, somehow they're going to catch us. They're going to know that we knew and that we didn't tell, and then we're going to be in big trouble. This is good news. And plus, the people in the city were starving. Even that very night, people were still starving of hunger, and they were out there, and they had good news, and they need to go share that good news with the people in the city. So verse 10, they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, we came to the camp of the Syrians. Behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there, nothing but the horses tied and donkeys tied and tents as they were. Then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told them within the king's household. The king rose in the night, and he said to his servants, I'll tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They knew that we are hungry. Therefore, they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking when they come out, we shall take them alive and get into the city. That's actually pretty smart, I think, of the king. He thinks this is a trap. There's no way. People wouldn't just leave all their stuff. This is the bait. And as soon as we all run out there, they're going to fall on us and kill us. Now, if he had remembered what Elisha said, maybe he would have put two and two together and realized this is God's doing, but he doesn't think that way. So verse 13, one of the servants said, well, let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel who've already perished. Let's send and see. So they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, go and see. And they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. Not only was there a camp outside the city full of stuff, but there was a trail of things all the way to the Jordan as they're running, and they're just throwing their equipment, they're throwing down their stuff. So there was this whole, smorgasbord of things to go out there and have. So, verse 16, the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he laid to have charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gate, so that he died, as the man of God said, when the king came down to him. So that poor guy that questioned and challenged and did not believe got to be the one to open the gate. It reminds me of those Black Friday scenes that you see somewhere, right? Some poor soul's got to go over there and unlock the door on Target or, Best Buy or whatever, and the crowds come charging through. Well, he's the one that had to open the gate, and the people in there were all starving, and right on the other side of the gate is just tents full of food and money and everything you could want. And so as soon as he opens the gate, he collapsed. So he saw it, but he never got to taste it. He never got to experience it. And that's exactly what Elisha had said. Okay, let's think of 2 lessons from this, and the sermon will be yours. First of all, these lepers were smart. And one thing they realized is, if we just do nothing, we're going to die. Right? If we just sit here and do nothing, we're going to die. So we might as well do something, because doing nothing will be deadly. And sometimes we might need to come to that same conclusion that, if we just sit and do nothing, that's not going to go well. It ain't going to work. The way for things to work out for us is to take action. There's several people and examples of people who kind of got frozen in a state of doing nothing. One is Lot. You remember the angels came to rescue him. And in the morning, the city was about to be destroyed. And as the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife, your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. Why? I don't know. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. As they brought him out, they said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Even though Lot was a good guy, if he just sat there and did nothing, he was about to be destroyed with the whole city. His only chance for being saved was to take action, to do something. The same thing is true, of course, of us. In 2 Corinthians 6, we're told, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I'll make my dwelling among them and walk among them. I'll be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. We too are trapped in a city, in a culture, in a world that's going to be destroyed. It's already been, the die's been cast. This world's going to be burned up. It's going to be all punished and destroyed. Our only hope for survival, our only hope to be rescued, is to take action and to realize that we've got to do something. We've got to respond to this. Peter, on the day of Pentecost, as he was preaching, says, with many other words he bore witness and continued to exhort them, saying, save yourselves from this crooked generation. So those who received his word were baptized. There were added that day about 3,000 souls. If we want to be saved, we must do something. We must act. We must take action. A lot of people, I think, get kind of lulled into a sense of security. Maybe taking action is frightening. Doing something means taking risk. Remember the one talent man? He said, I was afraid, so I just kind of hid the talent. I didn't do anything. It takes courage. It takes faith to take action. But we have to take action, because if we just do nothing, if we just sit and do nothing, then we will be condemned along with the rest of the world. The second thing is, I think, we can learn from them, we can't remain silent. You'll recall that they said, and as they're scurrying back and forth and enjoying their sudden, wealth and food, they realize we're not doing right. This is a day of good news. If we remain silent till morning, we will be punished. So the question for us is, have we also found good news? If we escape from the city that's doomed to be destroyed, have we found salvation? And if we have, then are we like the lepers when they're just running around enjoying it for themselves? Or have we had that thought come to our mind, it wouldn't be right for me to just be shoveling all this in and enjoying all this while everybody else is still lost and everybody else is still starving and everybody else is still condemned? Don't I have an obligation to share what I have found, to let them know about what I have discovered? We too have a great salvation. Colossians 1:13, He's delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And as the apostle said in Acts 4, Peter and John answered him, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge, but we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. Like, you can't expect us to be quiet. We're going to tell it. We're not going to be quiet. We're going to say what we know. And that's the challenge for you and me. I realize we're not all apostles. We don't all have the same abilities or opportunities. But I wonder if we're as excited about the salvation that we have found as they were. Are we as excited about the salvation we found as even those lepers were? Do we have the same care and concern and fear that the lepers did? That, hey, we owe it to everybody else to share the good news. And if we just sit on it, could we get in trouble? Have we not found wonderful news? Are our own countrymen not also dying? And should we not at least ask ourselves, what's going to happen if I remain silent? I think that's worth pondering as we consider the example of these lepers. So first of all, if there's anyone who has been just sort of stuck in neutral and you've never taken the step of becoming a Christian, of course we want to offer you that opportunity. As Peter said, save yourself. The Lord has done His part and He's made the message known, and now you have to respond, and nobody can do it for you. It's something that each of us has to do, and we have to take action, and you have to take action. Just doing nothing will not result in salvation. And secondly, if we have found that salvation, have we had the same joy and excitement to share that with a lost and dying world? I think if we're being honest, we all would probably say, I could do better about that. And so let's take that as a kind of kick in the pants this week, to look for an opportunity to let someone know what we have found in the good news and what the Lord has done for us. If there's anyone here tonight who needs to make something right in your life, please let us know as we stand and sing.